he also relates in his book about, when he was a young lad, he'd go to church, and there was a girl that he thought was pretty cute, and so he'd always scheme things so he could be in the same aisle with her, and ultimately, he'd follow her and her father home after church before he, had enough nerve to actually introduce himself and stuff. So it's fun reading these stories. It certainly was to me anyway. Some of the stories were written specifically for the book. This one in particular I want to talk about. I was researching a home in the village and came across an article on Ancestry.com. Some of you may have used that site for genealogical work and the like. And then some people, they put their family stories there. And this gentleman, this Robert Clover Johnson, had written maybe a page and a half to write up on his grandparents. I saw the story there, and I contacted him because there was an email link, and asked him if I could include that story. And he said, Tom, he says, I'd love to really embellish on it because there's so much that wasn't told about that story, and he asked for the ability to write that story up. The story is about 34 pages of the book. It's really more than, I was trying to keep all of these stories down to maybe 10 pages at most. But his story is so compelling. He had, in my sense is he's about 60-ish or so. When he was 17 years old and living in Indiana, he found out for the first time, he had just wanted to see the West Side Story. It had just come out about that period of time. And he was excited about it. He was telling his mother that she really has to go. And his mother said, well, I could never go to that. And he said, it would just be too emotional. He said, well, what do you mean? Yes, it's an emotional story, but wouldn't you want to see it? He says, I couldn't. And when he pressed her, he said, well, it's because but my father killed my mother. He had never heard this story. When they had lived in Whitefish Bay for a period of time, when this incident occurred, they went back to the family community. They were from Indiana initially. The family was instructed never to tell the kids anything about that. So he and his sister were never told these stories. He stumbled across it when he was 17. And then after his mother died, he found all of these papers and these news clippings and stuff that told about this horrific chain of events. I won't recite the whole story because he tells it very, very, I think very well and very sensitively. He wants to he tried to get in the head of his grandfather a little bit. His grandfather killed his grandmother. Trying to understand what may have happened, what may have caused that. There was a mistress involved. The nature of the murder was pretty horrific. It occurred. This apartment building is the first apartment building built on Whitefish Bay. It's on Chateau. It's still a very imposing structure. His grandfather designed that structure and then lived in it. He also built one in Shorewood, very similar to this structure. Very gifted individual. This is the stories when it came out. They made, of course, major headlines in this community. They also got picked up across the United States. You can pick up the New York Times in this period of time and find a story talking about the nature of this murder. And just to give you some sense of how things were different in those days, people in this community, they wanted to see the body. And they were allowed to. People lined up at the mortuary and were allowed to come through and view the corpse. People wanted to see where it occurred, so people were allowed to go into the apartment building and stuff. It just, that it was a very sensational crime. We think it's the only murder that's ever occurred within Whitefish Bay.
What year was that?
I believe it was, I should know specific. I think it was 1922 or so. 23? Okay, thank you. I'm not good at dates. But I think you'll find that story very engaging. I know at least I did. And the author of the story, for him it was kind of cathartic. Is that the right word? It helped him to tell the story because it helped helped him to try to understand maybe what had happened to his grandfather and things like that. And he's very thankful to have had the opportunity to publish a story as part of that. I also stumbled across a story that was published in the Orlando Sentinel about a woman that grew up in Whitefish Bay. She grew up above Ott's drugstore, and when I contacted the family, I found out that she had died. And again, I think she only died about 2-3 years ago. But she's a very, very good writer, and about 3 of her stories, I believe, were picked up in the Orlando Sentinel. I was actually given a book of all of her stories. She wrote her stories and then presented it to the grandkids. So, part of the reason for this Muzzy, the grandkids called her Muzzy. So, she's got a story about, as a young child, about wanting a dollhouse over a Christmas period, and she was so disappointed she didn't get it, and all that sort of stuff. She ultimately donated that dollhouse to a museum down in Florida, and they were delighted to receive it, just because the story behind the dollhouse, and apparently was very ornate and very intricate. There are 3 chapters from her. This is her as a little girl on the 4th of July, I guess. This is what, you can just barely perhaps see the marquee that says Ott's Pharmacy. Ott's ultimately became Fitzgerald, and it was moved across the street into a newer building at the time. Her dad, Bud Rockwood, was seen by others in the pharmacy industry as being, very, very advanced at the time. He had designed this horseshoe type, fountain, and others replicated it when they saw his design for it. He also dummied up an air conditioning system for for his little ice cream parlor and all that sort of stuff, and had a real reputation as being pretty innovative. She writes a story, the first one I came across, she says, I was a latchkey kid, and her story is where her parents would be working in the pharmacy. She would come home from school, she would let herself into the apartment. She actually used a butter knife to get into the block at that time. She would do her studies. At some prescribed hours, she would come down. Her parents, I think her mother would do the books. Her mother would give her the bag of cash, and she would take that and she would walk down the block to the Heritage Bank. Things you probably wouldn't entrust upon your kids these days with safety issues and things like that. But she's an excellent storyteller, and I was just delighted to have the opportunity to include her stories in the book. Several news stories were written. One submitted as the Whitefish Bay's personal history project, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. One provides a summary of some of the early farmers and settlers in the area, and one is a chapter which narratives of some of the movers and shakers that grew up in our community. And I'll just talk for a moment on this last subject a little bit. I've got some of the images of the people that, just a few of the people that, what I was looking for is people that really had developed a national commons that had lived in Whitefish Bay at one point. Julius Heil was governor of Wisconsin, and he also had a national reputation. I wanted to include a picture in the book. He was featured on the cover of Time magazine, and I found out that Time magazine preserves its rights for those covers, and I could have included it, but it would cost $500, which just about wiped out much of the profits for it, so we didn't. Jane Archer was a pretty noted actress for her time. In fact, there's a book on her life was just published, something like Nazi Bride, I believe it's called. She went over to Germany right before the Second World War broke out, and she was working with Otto Preminger and others, and she went to the school there. The war broke up. She met the band that she ultimately married while she was over there, so she was reluctant to come back. She ended up getting trapped, essentially, in Nazi Germany during the war. She and her husband tried to escape once. They could not. So she relates that story in her book. I've just got a couple paragraphs talking about some of her accomplishments, and she was a pretty noted actress. Kristen Johnston, I think a lot of people may recognize that, the Third Rock from the Sun and that sort of stuff. This guy, a number of people in the village, when I was telling them, was looking for stories about historic people in the village. They want to tell me about Henry McInnes, who, what was his, trying to think of his stage name. Jeffrey Hunter. Jeffrey Hunter. Okay. Yeah, and he actually, played Jesus Christ in a fairly famous film that came out. This picture here, I just thought it was a phenomenal picture. It's a fairly recent photograph for this book, considering it's on history of the village. This is probably only taken 4 or 5 years ago or so. This is Peter Buffett. Peter Buffett, of course, we know for a while he owned the Pabst Mansion, lived there, I think, for about the Eli Mansion. I'm sorry, excuse me. The Eli Mansion, lived there for a number of years. He ultimately married Jennifer Heil. Now, I don't know. This juxtaposition of Julius Heil and Jennifer Heil, I don't know if they're related or not. I need to find that out. It's part of one of the things on the list to try to find out. Peter, of course, is the son of Warren Buffett, the big billionaire or whatever. He has bestowed each of his kids with over $1 billion individually so they could establish their own foundation. So Jennifer, right now, her role is she runs this foundation, the Noble Foundation, $1.2 billion, all dedicated to helping young girls that are disadvantaged across the world. A lot of that effort is, as you can see from here, helping disadvantaged kids in Africa and India and things like that. Girls that are in some jeopardy. In some cases, this foundation is established. She's a Whitefish Bay girl. She and her brother, they were twins. I believe her brother Joseph still lived in the village. So decided to include them in the book. But this is the guy that really surprised me. Abraham Cressy Morrison. For any of you that have gone to the internet and gone to Google search engines and tried to find the name of somebody, if you look, I tried to find Jack Sullivan's descendants because I wanted to let them know I was going to include his story in the book. There's so many Sullivans in the, you had Google with Sullivans and, you would never find it. There's just too many of them, obviously. But Cressy Morrison's name is so unique. And then you put in Abraham. It's Abraham Cressy Morrison. You figure there's probably only one of those guys out there. Although as I started looking into that, and the reason first of all, I wanted to find out about him is I was looking at this fairly modest home located on Bay Avenue because of putting together research on the significance of some of the structures in Bay Avenue. Mimi Bird identified this home as Cressy Morrison's cottage. So who's Cressy Morrison? There was no information, at least that I've been able to find in the Mimi Bird files on him. But when I Googled for Abraham Cressy Morrison, I kept hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hits, and all seemingly on the same guy. Although, as I was looking, I think I told Sue I was struggling with it because it almost seemed like they were talking about maybe 2 or 3 people. Maybe one was him and one was his son or something like that. But it's all the same guy. And I think he's probably the most famous person that's ever lived in Whitefish Bay that nobody knows anything about. So this guy, his story largely is as a young lad, somehow or other people understood that he had pretty good writing skills. And he gets working for the pharmaceutical industry. Somebody had hired him at one point to go out and survey like 100 and some pharmaceutical manufacturers, and I don't know what the survey was supposed to determine, but that's what he was doing and he's doing this when he's like 21 or so. Somehow or other he came to the attention of Pabst. Pabst hired him as his first marketing guy. He's looking for a writer, somebody that could kind of give some pizzazz, help sell some beer. So he moves to Milwaukee. I don't know if he also had a home within the city, and then he had this cottage up here in Whitefish Bay. That was, we were a cottage community at one point. People that lived in the city would have some cottages. There were 3 or 4 cottages located on bay, and then right off of bay, there were a few more that were, essentially close to the lake. So it was kind of attractive during summer months, of course, like many of us do now, head to the North Woods. Well, this was the North Woods for people in the city of Milwaukee at that time. One of the things he got involved in, and perhaps it was also to help sell beer, he got involved in the wheelmen. The wheelmen, you call them bicyclists these days, but that's what the wheelmen were. There were societies of wheelmen, and largely their role in life, it was, of course, club riding, and there was a very popular ride going up the Whitefish Bay toll roads from the city of Milwaukee, and they would come up to the Pabst Whitefish Bay Inn. Very, very popular route, and the wheelmen also lobbied for better roads, because you couldn't bike on ruts and all that sort of stuff. And most of the roads across the country during that period of time were terrible roads. That's why the Model T was, the Model T could navigate those things. Bicycles didn't do real well. So he also gets then a reputation for lobbying the state government for improving the roads within the community. He somehow or other. Now let me see, how do I do this one? You've seen this image, that was the first image that I had, and there's images in the first book on Whitefish Bay. The McGee and King families, they're very historic people, lived in Whitefish Bay. They were some of the first commuters. They lived in Whitefish Bay and take the trolley into the city of Milwaukee. King, McGee, and Powell. They ran a publishing business, the 3 gentlemen. 2 of them lived in Lake Drive, and on the home that you can just barely see in that image. The third one, Mr. Powell, lived right on Day. So he was essentially a neighbor of Cressy Morrison. Well, these guys published books. Well, Cressy Morrison starts writing. They commissioned a book that's one of the first coffee table books. It was photographs, I don't know if I pronounced that word right, photographs essentially of the city of Milwaukee in that area. It was a I think you'd call it a two-tone or so. It was black and white, but it was a grayscale. They used a technique they called photographer. There weren't many publishers that could actually print that stuff. It was a pretty famous book that includes these photographs of the community. It starts with a foreword on the history of Whitefish Bay. The foreword's written by this Cressy Morrison. Cressy Morrison then goes on to write a number of other books, some of which were published by these 3 guys from Whitefish Bay. They had a very famous, with a national reputation, a publishing house, and so this guy's writing for them. Then lo and behold, I don't know exactly what happened, he leaves this area, goes out to New York. He ultimately becomes the president of the New York Society of Science. I may have that wrong. But it's the New York Scientific Society of some sort. And he donates, after he works for them for a while, as the president of their organization. Now this is a kid who never graduated from high school. People call him Dr. Morrison. The only doctorate he ever got was an honorary type doctorate. But he at one point he donated money toward the prize that came with his name, the Cressy Morrison Award. So if you hit Google and you search his name, you get people that have gotten this award. They also have gotten Nobels. At least 3 Nobel laureates got their Cressy Morrison Awards first before they got Nobel prizes. So this guy, he gets some real national prominence, international prominence in some cases. In fact, there's a story about somebody who got this Nobel. He wanted to get his grandparents' furniture out of Nazi Germany and used the prize money from the Morrison Award to get his grandparents and their furniture across the pond to the United States. Just some interesting stuff. But finally, if you Google on this guy, you get all of these hits, all related to a book that he wrote at one point. I think it was titled something like 12 Reasons a Scientist Believes in God. Now you get a provocative title like that, as you can imagine. People that look for is the existence of God, may stumble across this book, and they did. He ended up, it got condensed version of it got published in the Reader's Digest. So there are people today that are debating the merits of his book, that are taking a look at his justifications, his rationale for the existence of God, and then people taking the other arguments about, no, that doesn't prove anything. And, this debate, of course, will go on for eons. A very, very interesting character. And, without this kind of type of research, and fortunately he had a name that lends itself toward this, which then gets you wondering, well, who else out there in the community, has done very, very significant things, and we just can't find that. It just, the search for information is endless. And, well, I'll talk about that just a little bit more. But I had mentioned earlier there were some stories that couldn't get published in the book. Some of them, just because of the page limitations. I was originally, the book is about 30 pages longer than the publisher wanted, and it was able to increase the coverage because of the story about the murder in Whitefish Bay. But there were a couple stories that I had to drop because of page limitations. There was also one other problem. There were a couple stories I wanted to publish, but that would have required getting the rights to use the images from the Milwaukee Journal, Milwaukee Sentinel, and it's gotten to be very, very difficult. The copyright laws are such that, if things were published before about 1907, you can pretty well include the images, but anything about after that, then you get into jeopardy if you publish anything without permission. And I attempted to get permission to include a couple of those stories, and it just got so onerous that I decided to drop them. And then, Scott may recall this, there was a time I just submitted the manuscript to the publisher, and I was doing some cleaning house, getting rid of some of the things, getting them back into the files there. And Scott says, oh, by the way, you might be interested in this. And it was this box here that I should probably have known that this project had gone on in the village, but there was a library project, when was it? Probably before your time. So somewhere around 1910 or so, there was I'm sorry, 2010. Somewhere around 2010, there was an effort, asking people to contribute their stories to the village. There's some excellent stories in here. One I was able to include, there was a last-minute substitution in one of the chapters, and I was able to include a story of one of the former librarians that worked in this community, and she tells her story about growing up in Whitefish Bay and provided some pictures and the like. But there's a dozen stories that arrived too late to be considered. I also had size limitations, so what do you do? So I'm going to talk about some of the outtakes, and then I'll, things that didn't make it in, and then I'll talk about the future plans to publish some of those things. One in particular I wanted to include this. In 1872, there was a very horrific explosion that occurred, and we're trying to determine exactly where it's located. The information, if you read the news accounts, and again, this was picked up in the New York papers as well with a very short, succinct summary. There were news accounts that talked about this as being, I think, about 3 miles north of the city of Milwaukee, along the Whitefish Bay Turnpike. So, where is north of the city of Milwaukee? Is it north of the north limits of the city of Milwaukee, or is it north of the center of the city of Milwaukee? And there's this debate that goes on between us and Shorewood as to whether it's in Whitefish Bay and Shorewood. There's also, if you read the article, there's a Mr. Swain, a well-to-do farmer. Well, you would think that would, if he was close enough to hear that explosion and it rattled and the dishes fell off of his cabinets, you would think that would pretty well define it. But as it turns out, he's had property in Whitefish Bay as well as a property in Shorewood. We think that this was located right off of Henry Clay at the bluff. So, essentially Lake Drive, Henry Clay, right at the bluff. So close to where Pandas is right now. We think is where this munitions factory, if you will. The background here. Dual Line Well, everybody pretty well knows the story about Nobel, the Nobel Peace Prize and that sort of stuff. Mr. Alfred Nobel made his fortune making a dynamite that was relatively safe to use. Relatively meaning it would only explode if you wanted to explode. So you had to use a detonator with dynamite. And he wasn't the first to try to do this. There was a lieutenant, I can't think of his last name, but it had developed a process that did very similar, just slightly different chemicals, but it would take nitroglycerin. The whole technique was to take nitroglycerin and then, to put it with other compounds that would keep it from exploding unless you had a fuse, a propulsive fuse that would actually make it explode. And the story talks about a gentleman in a gentleman in the city of Milwaukee that was attempting to manufacture this dual line. And he was demonstrating to businessmen within the city of Milwaukee, down in the Menominee Valley, how safe it was to use. He would take it and he would hammer away at it and nothing would occur. And then he would put it underneath a plate of boiler steel, put a fuse with it, everybody would get back, it would blow up. Great demonstration, look how safe it is to use. And then look at how much explosive power this chemical has. All very, very true. He established, he got some backing then from Milwaukee area businessmen to begin producing dualine. And the plant for producing it was on the bluff. Being on the bluff provided some safety. It was a little lower than, so if there was an explosion, people wouldn't die that were not directly involved in it. Whether or not they knew some of the problems, it exploded on one of the coldest days. This occurred right around Thanksgiving. So the factory had gone into operation, fairly small operation, on Thanksgiving Day. So the temperatures were coming down is when this explosion occurred. And exactly what they were doing at the time, of course, we don't know because the people that were involved in it died. One including a very young lad who was 12 years old, and his dad also died. His dad was coming with his lunch pail during his lunch break. His father also died in the explosion. We think it may have occurred because nitroglycerin itself, while as it gets colder and colder, nitroglycerin can get safe, but right at the freezing point where it's half solid and half liquid, the crystals of nitroglycerin are extremely hazardous. You've got nitroglycerin fluid next to crystals that have all these sharp edges, if you can think of from a chemistry standpoint. And we think that's probably what happened, that perhaps they didn't understand the cold weather characteristics of nitroglycerin. But that story was supposed to be in the book, didn't make it. There was another one, this one didn't include it. I thought it would be fun to include because, the prospect of our lily whitefish bay community with cockroaches and stuff. This is a story from 1947. There was a dump site located right now where Bayshore Town Center is located. So this is just north of Silver Spring, just west of Lydell. And the residents of Whitefish Bay were up in arms about this dump site because cockroaches were coming out of this dump site and the images of it occurred. I wanted to include that photograph, and the problem was getting the rights from Milwaukee Journal to include it. And I've got, not only the stories that were in that box, but just a dozen or more projects of things that could be included in now publication. I don't know if any of you realize this is it's part of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. This is their online presence. They've done this for each of the communities. The newspaper insert that we get on Thursday that's called North Shore Now, it's tied to the Whitefish Bay Now. There's also Shorewood Now, that sort of stuff. There has been, for a period of time, there's been monthly articles on homes located within Whitefish Bay. So a lot of those 217 homes, they've been on this Whitefish Bay website with information about each of them. So if you want information about that, you can find information about homes. And my intention is to begin publishing articles. There's the article on the dual light explosion, fuel line explosion rather that occurred, we think, in Whitefish Bay. That was just submitted. It'll probably be published in January. So that would be one location where we can go for those stories in the future. And I'm still seeking additional stories. You know, this is, I found the quest for this information both very rewarding, but, you know, at the same time, if we're going to preserve the history of the village, we've got to capture that history. And we've got to relate these stories to one another so people can understand what our history is all about. And I like to think of, you know, since this is Whitefish Bay and fishing is part of our heritage, I'd like to think about this whole effort as fishing for stories about our community. And you never know what you're going to find at the end of the line. If you'd like to discover more, you might want to consider joining the Whitefish Bay Historical Society. Now, as I've mentioned, the group has not been real active. We do have a president. Nobody's collected dues for a number of years, but you can go online if you can find this kind of a quirky name. It's wfbhistoricalsociety.webs.com. The reason it's got the webs in there is a free site, a free website. But you can actually sign on, and once we get you on our list, then we can send out information about various events that are going on in the community and the like. So if you're interested in learning more, you can find some information on their websites, and you can also sign up, and hopefully we'll have more information coming out on it. Also, you might want to take a look at some of the information in those volumes. They're incredibly valuable. There's a lot of very interesting stories located within. There's very interesting images on our early history. You know, in the volumes of the things that you can publish, you can only just publish a small fraction of the stuff that's out there. And, you know, as I also mentioned, you can also view it online now if you go to the Whitefish Bay WFBlibrary.org website. And then you might want to review the architecture and history inventory. Those volumes are located there. Or you can use the resources to search for the history of your own homes. You know, the techniques for doing that, there's a little publication that's, you know, talking about researching your Whitefish Bay home. I'll make sure that also gets, it's on our website right now, but I'll make sure that gets available. But it's a fun process. You know, one of the easy things you can do is there's phone books that go back to 1917 or something like that. So you can pretty easily find your address, and you can pretty well go through those phone books and find out who lived in your address. And then it's easy to get on the web. You start looking for ancestry and others to find out who those people were and what they did and who built your house and all that sort of stuff. And if you want to discover more, of course, we've got a couple books that you know, certainly be interested in giving you more information. Again, all proceeds go to the Whitefish Bay Historical Preservation efforts. So that's kind of the story. So, any questions? Why don't we start here? What are years of, you know, I'm again, not real good on dates, but I believe it was before 1900. Somewhere, you know, I'm guessing it was 1890 something. We do have a copy of it that was presented to the Whitefish Bay Historical Society. It's a pretty incredible book. You can also find it online. You know, Google has actually been able to scan some very early books. You know, again, before they were published before a certain date, they could pretty well get away with it. And you can find the entire document out there, and it's some pretty incredible stuff. So, question? Well, it's actually maintained by the Historical Society, and the president has it in her office right now. We should actually get it in. Yeah. I'll mention it to her and see if we can do that. Although it's a valuable document, and we have to be very careful in its use. Sure. Please.
You know, more current history. Do people realize what this building is built on? What was here before this building? The number 15 streetcar went by here in 1953. And you know that the track They just took out some of the track on Fairmount, but the track is still underneath on Ardmore, and the track is still underneath from Lake Drive to Hampton. There's still the streetcar track from 1953 underneath on Beaumont, not Beaumont, but well, it's not Marlboro. Marlboro is gone. I forget what street it is now, but the one that comes from Hampton. But those streetcar tracks are still underneath. And the streetcar used to go right by Whitefish Bay Middle School, which was at the time Henry Clay School. And there was no Marlboro at the time, so right underneath us was the streetcar tracks, and this is where the number 15 went, and it ended at, after it went out to the Pabst, they stopped that, and ended at Lake Drive in Silver Spring. So it was until 1953.
That's why we got this quirky, kind of diagonal street here within Whitefish Bay, and why the Village Hall is here, and why the fire department is here. These all of the strip, which was left over from the original dummy line, which then became the streetcar line with some modifications. But largely, this strip was based upon that dummy line route.
And people wonder why the curbs are so. They wonder why the curbs are so low on Ardmore. It's because now the asphalt is on top of the streetcar tracks, and there's only about this much of a curb. But that's some of our history is still with us in a way.
No, the dummy line went up Ardmore. The dummy line came from
Right.
Farwell, came up Ardmore, to above our people. There's a ranch house right there.
Yeah, I've actually got in the first book. There's a map that shows where the dummy line was, where the streetcar line, and they actually they overlapped, for a portion, because the dummy line ultimately got turned over to the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company, and the route was modified. But
Did the dummy line just stop right there and it's turned around way back down?
Well, originally the dummy line only went as far as Henry Clay.
Right, that's what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
but it was extended beyond that.
Okay.
Went up
It was
Lake Drive.
extended, I think, all the way up to Dave at one
It
point.
went in years ago. It went up to the Pabst, didn't it?
Yeah, but it went up to Pabst and then stopped at Walton Park,
Silver Spring.
and then it went back. But then it ultimately was extended because there was this subdivision on Day Avenue rather, and they wanted to have access to Day Avenue as well.
So in the days of the past resort, we just put the dummy line in there because there's a lot of people up in the past resort.
Yeah, exactly.
So it stopped right there and went back and got more people and left them more back.
Any questions? Well, I believe it was torn down about 1917. It was funny, I was asked, 14? Okay, 14. Again, I'm not going with the dates. It was funny, I was interviewed about a year and a half ago or so by, there's a class of, is it John Burroughs? Whitefish Bay High School, it's a civics class, and kind of civics history class, and one of the tasks they gave these kids is to interview people within the community to talk about the history of the village. And the question they came up with is, well, why did it close? And it was, my initial reaction was, well, prohibition, but prohibition didn't really start until after that. Well, so it begins, you begin thinking about, well, what else is going on during that period of time? And, there was an effort well before prohibition went into effect, to shut down a lot of these efforts. There was also the Second World War intervening. Well, this, the Whitefish Bay Resort was really very much a German resort. It was a German drinking club, essentially. And, being German in the city, once the First World War started, a lot of efforts were made to really kind of change that. And then transportation changed. There was a period of time in which, it was, if you wanted to escape the city during the warm summer months, that was about the only way you could do it. You could take the streetcar line, or you could take, a couple of the ships and get out. But it would be very, very difficult to get to Rhineland or places that people go these days to escape the summer heat. And of course, you didn't have air conditioning these days, so being right on the lake, that was very, very attractive. But a lot of those attractions began to get lost once roads were developed, once people had ready access to automobiles. They didn't need to go to a Whitefish Bay Resort anymore.
Where was it located?
Yeah, it was located just north of Henry Clay. So if you know where the Pabst restaurant is, I'm sorry, Handel's restaurant. Yeah, just north of that, there are several very attractive homes that kind of culminate with the Eli Mansion. So it was kind of all the way from Henry Clay all the way to where the Eli Mansion is located right now. And somebody told me that the band shell was essentially located right where the Eli Mansion is currently located. Oh, the Ferris wheel. Yeah, the Ferris wheel was on the car.
Kyle lived in one of those houses. Kyle's house was located in one of those lots that
Yeah.
one was the past.
Yeah, and that's why I've got to find out, if it'd be interesting because Jennifer Heil Buffett lived in the Eli Mansion, which was located right next to Governor Heil's, his residence, which is a very attractive looking Mediterranean style home located just south of the Eli Mansion. So you kind of wonder, was there any relation? It must be a question I can't answer. 1920 sometime, but I don't know.
Are there plans for any guided tours of these historic areas?
There aren't currently. There have been, over the years, there have been some bus tours. And there is a strip that the Whitefish Bay Historical Society has that was used during these bus tours. There was a recent open doors tour, I think, of the Shorewood area by Historic Milwaukee. And I'd be surprised if we don't have one in place in another year or two. It'd be another nice way to kind of tell the story of the community as reflected by some of the homes within the village.
Did the interurban come out this way then?
I don't believe so. No, I think it went west toward the Pewaukee area, if I recall right.
Now, the interurban went through Port Washington.
It did?
Yeah, it went through Port Washington, but then interurban went up Green Bay Avenue, farther out near Rufus King High School. The private right-of-way is still there. It crosses Hampton, went north, then went to Mequon. The Cedarburg interurban railroad station is still there as a museum, in case you ever go to Cedarburg. And the bridge that the old interurban went across to get to Grafton and Port Washington is still there in Cedarburg. So the station is very interesting.
Please.
You talked about the dummy line or the streetcar line that went through here. Marlboro Drive used to end on Hollywood and Silver Spring instead of on Lake Drive and Silver Spring. The intersection at Lake Drive and Silver Spring was closed, but initially the dummy line went up as far as Carlisle, and west of Lake Drive on Carlisle you'll find about 3 houses that are set in a semicircle. The dummy line used to turn the engine around there and then it would come back out.
Okay.
That's why those houses are setting back out of the way.
I had no idea. Okay. Well, that's, a good reason for us to gather together here and collectively tell our stories. And again, I would welcome, anybody that is interested in relating any of these events, correcting any information in the book or anything, as you read these stories, if it triggers other stories about your own experiences growing up in the village, I can't guarantee when it'll get published, but the intention is, to have a series of these articles that will appear in the local website. Maybe at some point we'll gather them up into another book and see where it goes, but who knows? So, thank you all for attending tonight.